Hi, Ben here, and we're down in the craft lab, and you're tuning in to the first part of our Sharpening our pole lathe chisels series. So we're going to start off with the most basic tool that you're probably going to start with. Even if you don't get any of the other chisels, this is going to be the first chisel that you're going to invest your money in. So this is the Gouge, or some people refer to it as the roughing out gouge. This one in particular I've had for a long time. I've had it since I was 17, and I've actually modified it quite a bit so that it's perfect for doing baby rattles, sweeping in these nice shapes on the ends of rounders bats and things like that. So I've ground it quite heavily and knocked off these corners. It will still do all the major turning as well, but because this has got quite a deep curve to it, quite a sort of heavy C-section to it, you'll find that it will take very small bites and nibbles out of the wood, so it's slightly slower to actually turn with. So if I know that I'm going to be doing lots of chair legs or bats and things like that, I sometimes swap over to a slightly wider, slightly flatter section gouge. So this is 35mm, and I've left it so that it's still got quite heavily pronounced corners to it, really. Having said that, both these tools are actually carving gouges rather than power turners gouges. You'll notice that they're a lot thinner in section, they're a lot lighter in the hand, much shorter handles so that we can turn and move the chisel in front of our body when we're actually turning on the pole lathe. So slightly different to conventional turning tools, much thinner, and we actually grind them to a much finer angle as well, so that they cut keener, leave a smoother, cleaner finish on the wood, because we don't rely on any sandpaper or anything like that. We're leaving the finish straight off the tool. So this is part of the reason why that we've got to make them razor sharp, so we leave that nice finish. The other thing that I would suggest when you buy a new chisel or you pick up a second-hand chisel, the angle might not necessarily be correct, but more often than not they've been ground with a flat grind, and you'll find that putting a hollow grind into your chisel will actually, it'll give you two advantages really. For one, when you've got the hollow grind on the chisel itself, on the bevel, you'll find that when it comes to actually honing, you'll have to remove very little material from the chisel itself. You'll only be removing steel from the back edge and the very front edge, because you've got that concave. The other advantage of the hollow grind is that it will actually mirror or match the concave or the curve of the thing that you're turning. So basically it will sit nicely on the wood and you'll get a less bumpy finish then. So I tend to use a Tormek grinder for grinding that hollow grind. The advantage of using a Tormek grinder like this is it runs through a water bath, so it will keep the edge very cool, so there's no fear of you scorching your chisel itself or losing the temper. Don't be tempted to use a high-speed bench grinder, because you'll ruin the chisel, especially when they're very thin like this. So first port of call is we're going to actually regrind this chisel. I've honed it quite a few times and the hollow is almost completely gone. I was turning a bit of chestnut and it's actually left a bit of tarnish on the inside, so I need to give it a little bit of TLC really. So we're going to set up, and I'm going to use what they call the universal jig. So Tormek make a wide selection of jigs to hold your chisel at the correct angle and very accurately, from kitchen scissors to kitchen knives to axes, and this is their turning range. So this is their universal jig, which I will slide onto the chisel with this little adjustable screw. Slide it in, giving yourself a good couple of inches of the actual chisel itself sticking out, and then just tighten that black plastic knob up. Make sure that it's held nice and secure, and then what we've got to do is we've got to take it and we've got to set it up to the correct angle on the actual Tormek itself. The angle we're going to try and grind it is about 25 to 22 degrees, so quite fine in comparison to the turner, like conventional turner's chisels. But yeah, we'll set up the Tormek and we'll get grinding. So once we've got that jig clamped onto the gouge, we then lay that onto this tool rest bar that's on the Tormek. And what we've got to try and do is create the correct angle. Now you can use the provided angle measurer. I just like to do it the old school method that I've always used, which is basically to lay it onto here, and I'm looking through that gap, and I want to make sure that that bevel of the chisel hits the hole of the stone. So at the moment I can see that there's a slight gap at the back of the bevel. So basically I've got to adjust this jig slightly so that this slides further into the machine. So the great thing about this new Tormek is it's got this fine adjustment. So I can slide a few turns on this little dial here and then slacken that, and that will allow that tool rest to sit further into the machine. And then I can just have another little look. And that's looking pretty good. That's looking pretty fine really. Maybe just do ever so slightly in a bit further. Now what I tend to do is I just wipe the chisel onto the stone like so, and I want to see where it's making contact with the stone. That's my sort of double reference point. Now if you're struggling to see where it's making contact, the old marker pen method that I sort of seem to use for absolutely everything. The marker pen is your friend when it comes to sharpening. So now I've got that nice black bevel, I can just wipe it onto the stone again and see where it's removing, and I can pretty much see it's removing all the pen from the bevel all in one go. So I pretty much know that that's the correct angle, and I'll lock off those two tighteners on the tool rest and we can start grinding. Now I've already filled the water trough, it's already absorbed a lot of water, and I've topped up that water trough because you've got to keep that stone wet. And I'm going to start the machine. It runs relatively slowly, but the essential part now is that I need to make sure that this part and the back edge of the gouge stay in contact with that toolbar, that tool rest bar. And I'm going to start in the middle of the stone, and I'm just going to roll the whole of the chisel across the surface of the stone. Now I move the chisel along the whole width of the stone itself. Because this is a curved tool, we don't want to just create a massive dip in our stone. We want to try and prolong the life of that grind wheel really. So after a few passes, it's worth just stopping and just checking. So we can see now that we're starting to create that hollow grind all along the bevel. The pen's been removed. It looks like I need to just roll my hand a little bit so that the grind comes further up the sides, up to these corners really. So you could, if you wanted to, you could repen it, but I'm quite happy that I can see exactly where I've got to go. So yeah, I've just got to concentrate on those corners a little bit more. Like so. So now we're starting to get right round to those corners, which is perfect. Now what you can do, if you've got a lot of material to remove, say you've hit a big knot, or you've maybe hit a nail or something in a piece of wood, and you've got a lot of steel to remove, you do get these stone graders with the Tormek, so coarse and fine, so you can actually roughen up the surface of the stone a little bit, and that will just make the surface of the stone a little bit rougher, and it will remove steel a little bit faster. Doesn't flatten the stone so much, so don't think that you true the stone with that. It will take out very slight dips, but it's mostly just for grading the surface of the stone. And what I want to do is I want to try and look and see if I can start to see the burr starting to form on the inside of the chisel. So I can see a slight burr there and a little bit there. Now the burr itself means that I've ground that bevel literally to a 0, so that it's actually starting to fold the metal over on into the inside of the gouge like so. So I'm going to look at that burr, and I'm going to try and make that burr nice and even all the way along the surface of the gouge, so I know that I've ground it completely so that it's ready for honing. Okay, so I've been keeping an eye on it, and I can now see that I've got a burr the whole way along the chisel now, like a little feathery sort of woolly edge that's basically the steel folding over into the inside of the gouge. So I can turn the grinder off, and I'm now going to hone it now to remove that burr. So now once you're successful, and I don't do this until you're happy that you've totally ground it, is then remove the jig. If you remove the jig first and then you want to try and put it back on, then you've got to start again really. So we've got our burr. So now what I want to do is I want to use some Waterstones to actually hone that. So I've got my Waterstones down here that I tend to keep soaking in just some water. You can actually use like Windex or something like that instead of water if you want to make sure that you don't get any surface corrosion on your carbon steel tools, but I just use water. And I've got a few different stones. Now for gouges, I like to use these, what they call Japanese slip stones. So they're shaped so that we can get those to fit the inside of the curve of the gouge itself. So we've got 1000 grit, which is this sort of red brick colour, and then we've got a 6000 grit, which is actually this sort of pale cream colour. Now that's the same combination of grits as what I use on my conventional flat Waterstone as well, so I'm using the same grits. But the first one we're going to use is that 1000 grit. Now what I tend to do is I want to try and polish this inside face, remove a bit of that tarnish from that sweet chestnut that's stained the steel a little bit, and I'm going to use this widest edge of the slipstone, and I use my ample belly to rest the chisel handle, and I'm going to support the chisel with my fingers, and I'm going to lay that stone dead flat on the inside surface. Make sure your fingers aren't protruding and they don't catch on that gouge edge, but I'm just going to polish that inside face. It won't take much, and obviously you haven't got to worry about polishing right down here, even though I'm resting the stone on there. It's that first few millimetres that we need to make sure that we clean up nicely. Now, once you've had a few passes on that inside face, we then need to hone this ground bevel. Now at the moment it's an absolutely true hollow grind, so this flat side of the stone should fit, and you'll feel it almost click with your fingers. You'll feel it sort of sit absolutely dead flat. And I sometimes just slide my finger ever so slightly off the edge, and that will increase the width of the bevel basically, so I can feel my finger rubbing on the stone. And then again, go back to your belly, rest it on your belly button, and then with small circular motions, and I'm also looking down from the top so I can make sure that I'm visually flat on that bevel. Small circular motions, and I'm just rotating the gouge round until I get right from the middle right to the corner, and then back again. Now it won't take much of this to remove a millimetre or so of that hollow grind at the very tip of the cutting edge. So you'll be removing a little bit of steel off the back edge and a little bit of steel off the front edge. And then we'll just give it a quick wipe, so make sure you've got a bit of cloth to hand and just very carefully wipe off any slurry. And what you'll start to see is you start to see this sort of crazy little pattern occurring. So because we're doing circular motions, you get this sort of swirly polished edge on the back edge of the bevel, and the same on the front. Obviously you won't be able to hit the middle of the bevel because that's hollow ground, so it looks to me like I need to just spend a little bit more time on this corner. So keep your surface of your stone wet and go back to those circular motions. So after you've done a few passes with the 1000 grit, I normally just clean off that slurry, check that I've got all the way across that bevel, which I can see I have now. And now I want to refine that sort of scratch pattern. So exactly the same process, but with the 6000 grit Waterstone. And as you can probably hear, it's much finer. It's not really removing any amount of steel, it's purely polishing it. Now when I think of sharpening, I always think sharpening is a bit like using a piece of sandpaper on a piece of wood. You start with something relatively coarse, and then you get finer and finer and finer. So using this 6000 grit, we'll put a really nice polished edge on there. But you'll probably find you'll really always struggle to get the burr completely removed with using a flat stone. So after a few passes with the very fine 6000 grit, we'll clean off the slurry, and then we'll polish it even more. So you can see it's starting to turn black, so you are removing steel, but very small particles. So we'll pop those back in the water. It's a good idea to just keep a rag to hand, keep it clean. One, so you can see what you're doing, but also the next stage we don't want it to really get any wet on there, any water on this. But you can see now we've got still that hollow grind in the middle, but we've got this sort of polished section of bevel at the back edge and a polished bit of bevel at the very front edge. So we want to try and make sure that we remove any of that microscopic burr that might be left. So we use some leather with some honing paste applied. So this is one of our flat strops that we use for chisels, knives, axes. And then we've also got one of our strops from our carving tool sharpening set. And this has got a nice radiused edge that's pretty much the same curve that's on those Waterstones. So apply a bit of the Tormek paste to it. So this is produced by the people that make the Tormek grinder, and it's a very, very fine polishing paste, and it allows me to remove any microscopic burr but leave a really nice polished edge. So we use that curved section of the strop to get onto that inside face, and you could use the flat section of this strop to do the outside bevel, but I kind of like the weight and the thickness that this has got. Same scenario as when we were honing. I sometimes just slide my finger ever so slightly beyond the cutting edge itself, just to make that bevel just ever so slightly wider, just so that you don't round it over too much. And this is just going to put this absolutely mirror finish on the chisel. Now you might think this is extreme for sharpening your chisels or your tools, but as I say, we're relying purely on the razor sharp chisel leaving the finish on the woodwork, so we're not going to be spending hours sanding the turning that we're doing. So a nice sharp chisel is going to be a real joy to use. So after a couple of passes, I'll just make sure that I give one final swipe on that inside, and you can just give it one little pass on the outside. And I'm pretty happy that that's razor sharp, ready to go. So like I say, clean off any slurry, and I normally make sure that I apply some form of prevention for corrosion. So obviously we've been using Waterstones, there could be some residual water on there, so I like to use these Camelia Oil applicators purely because it's food safe and very convenient, no CFCs, but you could use a bit of WD-40 or a bit of gun oil if you wanted to, but this is just a nice way of protecting your chisel. So if you weren't going to use that straight away, you could know that you could put it away in your tool roll and it'd be good to go. But yeah, that's just one sharp chisel. So we've got our freshly sharpened gouge, which initially we'll use for roughing out this blank and also for any kind of hollowing work. So let's see if our hard work paid off. So we're getting those lovely streams of shaving coming off. We're getting a nice finish. Perfect. So that was sharpening the gouge. Obviously we had the advantage of having a Tormek grinder. For those of you that haven't got that piece of equipment and you're wondering how you can remove a lot of material on an old chisel or one that's been damaged, you can do it with just a very coarse Waterstone or a diamond stone preferably. This will work very aggressively, it'll remove a lot of material quickly, and it will stay relatively flat as well. The only disadvantage of that is that you'll only end up with a flat grind on your bevel basically, but it just means that when you're honing you'll just have to remove more material really. So it's all possible whether you've got a Tormek or Waterstones. Use what you can really. But hopefully that's given you a few pointers of how to keep your tools really nice and sharp. Obviously that's the first in the series of the turning tools that we're going to show you how to sharpen. And if you've got any questions, just let us know, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some top tips. But yeah, tune in for the other chisels, and hopefully you'll get your whole set of pole lathe turning tools razor sharp and ready to go. Thanks again for watching.